Good evening, and welcome to Intellectual Publics. My name is Ken Wissaker, and I'm the director of the program, which comes to you from the Graduate Center at City University of New York. I'm also senior executive editor at Duke University Press. Tonight, we have a very special program featuring two brilliant and gifted writers with much needed books. Farah Jasmine Griffin, Read Until You Understand, The Profound Wisdom of Black Life and Literature, and Obery Hendricks, Christians Against Christianity, How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Faith. Before I introduce them, I'd like to thank Chelsea Largent, who runs the Intellectual Publics program with me. She is finishing up her PhD in comparative literature at the Grad Center while teaching at Brooke and at Queens. I'd also like to thank John Chianesi from the Grad Center, who makes sure the webinar works as it should. Our next event will be Monday, December 13th, a conversation with Mackenzie Wark and Sophie Lewis on Mackenzie's new book on Kathy Acker, writing, sexualities, and trans identities. I've been looking forward to tonight's conversation all fall. The title of Farah's book comes from a note her father gave her in a Black history book in 3rd grade. Read until you understand. Jazzy, read this book. You may not understand it at first, but read it and understand. Daddy, baby, read it until you understand. Ask your teacher if you don't understand. She understood the assignment. The beautiful opening of the book, this book begins with a girl and ends with grace, says everything. Going back and forth between memoir and literature, past and present, Griffin achieves a grace that is revelatory and beautiful in every way. Obery Hendricks' book is also about grace, perhaps in another sense, but it opens with a prophetic fury, telling the story of the Trump years, which I think we would like to be more over than they are, and really the long Trump years, since Hendricks helps us understand what made them possible, their white supremacy, their use of Christianity to be completely unchristian. It's a powerful book from start to finish. As an aside, as a publisher, I can't remember a book with more first-line blurbs. Brittany Cooper, Eddie Glaude, Cornel West, Michael Eric Dyson. Last time you'll see the two of them in the same place. Mark Lamont Hill, Marion Wright Edelman, the Reverend Al Sharpton. That's only about half of them. Our guests are also, as many of you know, partners. I was anxious to hear them talk about their books and also about writing together and separately, a recurrent theme that we've raised in this program. They will converse until about 7:40, and then I'll come back and pose questions to them, which you can put into the chat or the Q&A. More formally, Farah Jasmine Griffin was the inaugural chair of the African American and Africa Diaspora Studies program at Columbia University, where she was also William B. Ransford Professor of English and Comparative Literature. She's the author of many books, including most recently Read Until You Understand, and the recipient of a 2021 Guggenheim Fellowship. She lives in New York. Obery Hendricks is though the book is a lot about Philadelphia, gotta say. Obery Hendricks is one of the foremost commentators on the intersection of religion and political economy in America, a lifelong social activist, a widely sought lecturer, and media spokesperson. Dr. Hendricks is the author of the best-selling book, The Politics of Jesus, Rediscovering the True Revolutionary Nature of Jesus's Teachings and How They Have Been Corrupted, from Doubleday in 2006. The Universe Bends Toward Justice, Radical Reflections on the Bible, the Church, and the Body Politic, from Orbis in 2011, and Christians Against Christianity, How Right-Wing Evangelicals Are Destroying Our Nation and Our Faith, now out from Beacon. So I will let them get to it and really look forward to this conversation. Thank you both for being here tonight.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Ken. Yeah, thank you very much. And hello, Dr. Griffin.
Dr. Hendricks.
I haven't seen you for a while. It's been a couple hours now.
2 hours, yes.
Yeah, I'll have us say, I would let folk know that we have not rehearsed anything. We decided to be spontaneous, and therefore perhaps less given to artifice and deception. But I've been looking forward to this. Farah, so tell us and tell me, when did you decide that you wanted to be, when did you know that you wanted to be a writer?
Wow. That's a good question. I think I always knew I wanted to be a writer. Like from the moment I knew there was such a thing, even as, a very young girl, I think by second grade, I knew I wanted to be a writer. I had heard people like Sonia Sanchez and Nikki Giovanni, who were popular poets. And I thought, oh, I'd like to be like that. And so I think that early, I was trying to write stories in second grade and making up things and keeping little notebooks. But how about you? When did you decide you wanted to be a writer?
It's interesting because I think I started writing little things when I was about 10 years old. I had a little notebook, and I wanted to be a philosopher. So I was writing, little, well, what I thought was, philosophical thoughts. But I don't know, something seemed to have interrupted that. But it was when I joined Black Nationalist Movement, and was organization led by Amir Baraka, and I was very influenced by him, and that's when I really embraced being a writer. I think, seriously though, those days, all the brothers were trying to be poets, and most of us were very, very bad poets, but we knew how to do that thing, like, my sister, you are so beautiful. Like you could write a poem of 10 words if you just said them slowly. And I want to know you. Yeah, and yeah, so essentially, but then I got interested. I didn't become interested in really seriously interested. After I went through that Black arts period, and I was trying to write political commentary, which was, very forgettable. But it wasn't until I got into, I went to Princeton Seminary, as you know, before I went to graduate school, and that's when I really got serious about writing. So summarize, I became interested at 10, but I had these, these various levels of interest until I really just decided it would be part of my vocation, later in life, unlike you.
Well, no, I think that when I think about it, every school I went to, I was, writing for the little publication or trying to edit it. And I wrote a lot of bad poetry. I wrote bad poetry, elementary school, junior high school, high school. I wrote better essays. And I actually think that when I began to study writing seriously all through college, I thought I was going to be a writer. I wasn't sure how I'd make a living. But then when I started really reading as a critic, I felt like I hadn't earned the right to call myself a writer, even though spiritually I felt like that's what I was. So I like that phrase when you say embrace it, at what point do you embrace it fully? And that's been a back and forth.
Yeah. The embracing part. It's funny. Even after I published my first book, I still couldn't describe myself as a writer. I was someone who'd written a book, but I didn't feel like I was a writer.
Even though you'd written a novel, your first book was a novel.
Yeah, and it was, well received, except for the the terrible review in the Washington Post, which I still think the brother had it in for me. It was the brother who wrote it. It was so mean spirited. I mean, he hadn't even read the book. It was obvious, but you know, I think it wasn't until my second book that I start. You know, no, it wasn't until after I'd written my second book that I would say I was a writer. I mean, I would not call myself a writer. I was a professor. What do you do? Well, I'm a professor. I never said I was a writer. You know, that was sort of, but now that I've embraced it, you know, I'm a writer.
That's right.
So, you know, in your lovely book, you know, you share that your father is your earliest intellectual influence, and some of the texts that he has, you read, and then you share that Toni Morrison was one of your most important critical thinkers. Who were some of the other thinkers so that influenced you? And you mentioned a lot of the Black women writers. What male writers influenced you? And,
oh yeah. Well, you know, like you said, Toni her work was important to both of us. I mean,
oh yeah,
do a whole conversation about that. So I think, you know, Du Bois, and there are many Du Boises, and, you know, I've learned from all of them, the ones that I've encountered and continue to try to understand.
You mean different phases of his thought?
Du Bois, But as a writer, it was Souls of Black Folk that really, you know, I think the ways that we now understand it as being this kind of interdisciplinary, multi-generic, I didn't have that language for it, but the way that it was lyrical and beautifully written and poetic, and yet you know, he's a historian here, he's a sociologist there, and there's a space for his autobiography, and
he's a novelist.
Exactly. It just, you know, I think Du Bois, certainly of the male writers, also Toomer, Jean Toomer.
Well, I still can't understand.
Who I love, and we can talk about him more. I first found Cain in my high school library, and I looked at it and I didn't know what on earth was going on, but it just was so mesmerizing to me that I kept returning to it. And I think, like Du Bois, it's that way of not being bound by genre, you know, and taking Black folks seriously, you know. That those were, and then later on, Ellison, Baraka were really important to me. In addition to all the women writers, Zaki and Toni, the two Tonys, you know, Paul Marshall and all of them, who, you know, as I was coming of age as a thinker, there was just this burgeoning of writing by Black women that was available to me that I was so grateful for. But how about you? I know Baraka was really important to you, but who else were some of the things?
Yeah, Baraka was very important. I wrote an essay for, I think I was a sophomore at East Orange High School, and the teacher, this white teacher, real cool. She gave me a sort of a low grade, you know. So many of us were trying to write like in the Black arts literary genre, and so I'm sure it was not good. But I showed it to Baraka and I said, man, you know, she didn't like this. What do you think? And he wrote back, he wrote on it, a fool wrote the commentary, talking about the teacher. So I suspect he just said that for my benefit. But you know, that gave me a measure of affirmation. But what I didn't mention, as you know, what really gave me affirmation when I was in graduate school at Princeton University, Toni Morrison just, you know, she was just just a gem, and we were so blessed that she became such a close friend to both of us. But at the time, I was a student, and I asked her to, I mean, like she had nothing else to do. I would ask her to read my papers, my seminar papers. And, oddly enough, she would, because she befriended me as an older student. I think she might have pitied me, or I don't know, but anyway, she befriended me. And anyway, she wrote me a little note that said, "Obery, you write well." And like, whoa, what'd she do that for? Man, she created a monster. So yeah, I mean, that really was a very important influence to me. And then, reading her work was influential as well. But, coming up, when I said I read philosophy, I read people like, I'm trying to remember, I read book, the Story of Philosophy, which talked about the different philosophers. His last name begins with a D, I forgot, but I have the book up here somewhere. And it was a survey of the various philosophers going back, I guess, to Aristotle and coming forward. And it was written for the average reader, and I was a little ahead of my grade in terms of reading, so I could follow it. But then I started reading a lot of Indian philosophers, and mystics. Krishnamurti is one I read quite a bit, and there were a number of others whose names I don't recall. But I also read a lot of esoteric texts, a lot of religious texts. And the experience I had, my first career was on Wall Street, and one Saturday I was stopped in the bookstore, and I saw a book called The Gnostic Gospels by Elaine Pagels, right? It caught my eye because I read all these religious texts all the time, and this book was, it just blew me out of the water. I mean, it just opened up so many doors when she showed these esoteric, what they call this Gnostic Gospels, that deal with inner knowledge and gnosis. And so this was on a Saturday. I was reading it during the week, sitting at my desk at E.F. Hutton. And so I had a question. I picked up the phone and called, I knew no better. I called the relation department at Princeton and said, I want to speak to Elaine Pagels. Even though she was, a well-known award-winning scholar, I thought I'd just pick up the phone. I didn't know any better. But so the secretary said, well, Elaine is not here. She's on sabbatical. Would you like to speak to John Gager? Okay. And I spoke to him, and I asked him a question about a writing called the Didache. I pronounced it Didache. He didn't even know I was talking about it first, but he was gracious. But the reason I mention it is, as you know, that years later, I became Elaine Pagels' graduate student and John's graduate student. Years later, they didn't remember talking to me. Of course, it was a seminal experience for me. And I ended up being Elaine's first grad student that she graduated. And so those were my my real influences until later when I got into graduate school.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, I was mostly influenced by literary writers and reading, everybody, American literature, the canon, the Western canon, and falling in love with T.S. Eliot at one point even. But it's when you mentioned Elaine Pagels, I was thinking it wasn't until much later for me, as a young professor, a woman who was on fellowship with me at the Bunting, what was then the Bunting Institute, recommended Elaine's The Gnostic Gospels, just, the book that you talked about. And for me, it was a game changer too. It was, I have to say it wasn't just an intellectual game changer. It was a life changer.
Yeah, and a spiritual.
Exactly. She, I was like, wow, she writes so beautifully, and one can write kind of brilliant academic work that is written so beautifully. It just really hit me. And then, I we can talk about this also later on. I mean, I didn't grow up with a kind of religious training or anything like that. I didn't grow up in the church. And it introduced me to a set of religious texts and an interpretation of religious figures that just really spoke to me, just really moved me. And so yes, that book was really important to me also much later on. And, but very, very important.
What's interesting is that if she was sort of an introduction, the book was sort of subversive to mainstream religion. So I mean, if that's was your introduction.
My relationship, as a girl, I was introduced to very fundamentalist Christianity, not fundamentalist in the same way that you write about, in the book, but fundamentalists. And
Black conservative ministry.
Yeah, apostolic, a certain kind of that. And because I wasn't raised that way, it was such a turnoff to me. Even though I admired and loved many people who practiced the faith in that way, and they were good to me, there were certain things that were a turnoff, and I thought, if that's Christianity, I can never be a Christian. And then I read Elaine, and I thought, oh wait, this thing is much more capacious than I realized.
Yeah.
Right. And then, I think I understood it to be subversive, but it just made sense to me. It made so much sense.
Yeah. I mean, I absolutely made sense. But anyway, maybe we should just shift a little before we get too deeply into our faith understandings and struggles. So where do we go from here, my dear?
Well, I was going to ask you, well, first, I have two questions. One that I had planned, and then one that grew out of what you asked me. You asked me what male writers had influenced me. And when I first read Living Water, your novel, I thought, oh, he's been reading all these Black women writers. Like, so what was not just Black women, but what were the women writers that really, influenced?
Well, yeah, they were mostly Black women. Toni Morrison, very much. Song of Solomon. I mean, I recall when I finished reading that, I was just walking around the house going, woo, woo. I mean, it's so extraordinary. And of course, during the Black arts period, I read a lot of that literature and some of the sisters. But the womanist theologians, who, as you know, are another. For those who don't know, they're not Black feminists, but they are. That's as close as I can come to describe
gender and concern with gender, questions of gender and gender inequality, and
and racism, and which is they were intersectional before intersectionality became real popular term, and the womanists started. The womanists really influenced me, and made me really start to grapple with questions of gender and my own understanding. This book, as you know, Living Water was my reimagining of the story of the woman at the well who had 5 husbands, and Jesus encountered her, and I did an African American, rereading of that, and in trying to envision what those 5 different, ugly Negro husbands were like. In writing them, I started realizing that I was seeing some of myself in it, and the novel grew out of that great deal of pain. I cried a lot writing that novel, saying, oh my God, I didn't realize we brothers act like that, The genesis of the novel, though, was my rebellion against preachers who were using this text from John for against women. You know how these women are. You know, they're gold diggers, always looking for love in wrong places and all that kind of stuff. And you know, I wanted to write something that was meaningful. Actually, it started out to be an essay for Tahira, you know, our daughter, when she was graduating from high school. And but the influence of the womanist and all that in my head, and then my resentment of what I was seeing going on in church with women, the book, you know, grew out of that. And I think it was also my I was working something out of myself, but more than that, I think that was the happiest I've ever been when I was writing fiction.
Yeah.
And you know, I've written another novel, half of another novel, and then I started writing all this scholarly stuff, you know. And right now I'm asking some questions, like, you know, my work is making some difference, and it's been found to be, you know, very highly influential and all that. But my God, I'm happy writing fiction. But on the other hand, I'm trying to be part of the struggle against these forces of racial hatred and homophobia, you know, on a nonfiction level. So I'm struggling. I mean, I'm struggling between being a novelist and continuing to be a scholar, hopefully somewhat of an organic intellectual.
Mm-hmm. What made you make that switch from, you know, from the novel to the politics of Jesus? I mean, it's not that you hadn't been doing scholarship before. I mean,
well, yeah, I'd published before.
Right, but what made you switch? Why did you go that direction?
Well, I wrote The Politics of Jesus because I was just angry with usually I write out of anger. I was just angry with what I saw going on in the church, you know, and how they domesticated Jesus into some limp-wristed, you know, guy who was so worried about heaven that he was no earthly good and all that. And also because, you know, the church, but I'm thinking about the Black church in particular, the consciousness, the political consciousness quotient needs to be raised much higher. And that's what I was attempting to do with The Politics of Jesus. And, you know, what, 16, 17 years later, the book is still selling and still influential. And I think it was a good choice to make. I guess the reason I've been writing these fiction books, because the nonfiction, because I feel a responsibility to try to address these issues and raise a certain kind of consciousness within the church. The church is my site of struggle. So that's why I did that. But I would ask you, why haven't you written a novel? Why haven't you written fiction?
I've written fiction, I just haven't published it.
Well, I haven't seen any.
Yeah. That's a good question. I mean, I think, you know, I started out thinking that's what I would do. As I wrote, you know, yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I think that I actually think my academic life, my scholarly life, which has been very fulfilling for me, pulled me away from that. And I started to sort of ease back into it, not so much writing fiction, but with writing the kind of theatrical pieces, the collaborative pieces that I did with Jerry Allen and Ipatha Murkison, which were, you talked about the most joyous times of your writing life being writing fiction. For me, it was those creative collaborations were the most joyous.
Well, I guess so. I mean, you did them at the Apollo,
Yeah.
and the John F. Kennedy
Yeah.
Center. I mean, come on. I mean, could you be any higher?
Well, you know, it's funny because the joy of the collaboration of those projects wasn't even, I mean, I loved the performances because we worked with world-class artists, but it was really, you know, sitting with Epatha and Jerry and coming up with it together and writing stuff for them to read and Jerry putting music to it and Epatha directing it. I mean, it was that kind of the collaboration that I think people probably experience when they do theater all the time. And also very affirming. But, you know, I might return to fiction. One of my dear friends always ask about that. It's hard when you've been reading all these great writers or all, you know, for decades to broach fiction. That's hard. So we'll
Well,
see. We'll see. I want to follow up on something you said.
mhm.
You said something about I don't. You just said it. So I think you said writing is fighting, or you're angry. You write out of anger. You wrote these books out of anger.
Mhm.
Um, how does that, or does it influence your process at all?
Yeah, well, you know, some people can just write. And I have to have passion. There has to be something that moves my passion for me to do anything really. And then I, you know, give my whole self into it. And so when I say I write out of anger, I'm writing to counteract something. I'm writing I mean, I'm an Aries. I have a warrior spirit, you know. So, yeah, I guess you've noticed it over the years, huh? And so when I wrote The Politics of Jesus, I'm like, you know, I was mad. I was pretty upset with what I was seeing the wrong stuff preachers, you know, doing and saying, and how the Black church was being misled in so many ways by white theology and misinterpretation of the Bible. By the way, I became a biblical scholar because felt that that was the way I can most make a contribution in the struggle, because Black folks are in the church. And the other thing is just I felt badly about how folks were being abandoned
Mhm.
to churches, so many of which were wasting their time and resources and not helping change anything in society at all. They just changed the way people felt on Sundays, you know, for a couple hours. So anyway, so I mean, the anger or the passions always in response to oppression, to injustice. And that's when I wrote this, you know, this recent book, Christians Against Christianity. I don't even have to go into what that's about. I mean, these are the I was getting ready to cuss. These folks with their piece of trash leader, Trump, really are in a part of an evil movement. Now, not all of them have evil intent. Some of them are just ignorant, but they have to be counteracted. So that's what I see myself doing. When I wrote, what was the article about the problem with gospel music today? It got on my nerves because I was, you know, because I saw this performance orientation of gospel music and was really just became performances. And, you know, people were, people were doing all kinds of stuff, acting like it was in service to God, to the spirit and all that. And when it really was just entertainment, nothing's wrong with that. Don't get into a big entertainment thing and saying, you know, the Lord has moved me to do this. No, James Brown and Joe Tex might have moved you to do it, but let's be for real. But I'll stop there because that's, you know, I go a little far sometimes. Does that answer your question?
It does. It does. I mean, I think you're moved, and you know, I sort of see it when it's bubbling up. You know, when the passion and the concern is bubbling up, and have a feeling, oh, this is going to result in something. This is going to result in.
So what moves you?
I think, you know, I'm writing in my head. I'm writing all the time, and if I'm not, you know, I'm usually like, if I'm busy doing something else, if I'm busy doing something, building something or doing something administrative, in the back of my mind, I'm writing. And I'm always keeping notebooks and things like that. So I think I'm just moved by any number of things. Sometimes a conversation with another writer, a conversation with another thinker. Somebody says something and it sparks it off, and I want to engage them. I think all of those things move me to write. Wanting to enter sometimes into a scholarly conversation, wanting to say something. Oftentimes, I'm driven by the desire to pay homage to individuals and to a people. That drives me a lot. This last book was one part of it was always there, and I've been trying to write and tell that story for most of my life. And that's the part of the book that's the memoir part. And the engagement of the literary part really came about, like watching the 2016 presidential election and thinking that Black people, Black thinkers, Black writers had a lot to teach this nation about its so-called quest for democracy. And then the question became for me how to bring those two things together. But you are a warrior. I'm not a warrior. You're a warrior, and you throw down. So I can see definitely how that is what has motivated these books.
Well, I'm glad you wrote your memoir, because we struggled with that for a while, and I was encouraging you for a while, and but you had to wait till the time was right, and you had that fire in your belly and to get it out. And
well, the ways that for people who haven't read your book, everyone talks a lot about the fighting part, which is really important and making an important intervention, but you actually open up in a memoir voice. How did you make that decision to do that? And I think many of us want more of that.
Yeah, so I opened this book with, as you said, a memoir voice for a couple of reasons. One, because I was going to dive neck deep into what right-wing evangelicals believe, and to show how they are so wrong in so many ways, and how so destructive in the name of the Prince of Peace. That I wanted to begin by showing them that I'm not some outsider who's just standing outside and was a hater of Christianity and all that. So I talked about my childhood in the church and the legacy of my foreparents and the magnificence of their and dignity of their faith and the love that underlay it, and I just thought that was very important. But the other thing was, I want to also show the magnificence of Black church culture and rural church culture. And so I talked about my grandfather, this extraordinary man, and my funny grandmother, who was just, who taught her children to be so loving. And because we don't often get to do what you've been blessed to do, and what Tony modeled for so many of us, and that is to lift up the magnificence of Black culture. I also tried to do that in Living Water by making the Hebrew people, casting them in the African American rural people, and I plan to write a memoir at some point. I'd like to write more about my early life. I was born in Farmville, Virginia, and spent so much time there, and then grew up in an extraordinary place called East Orange, New Jersey, after we moved from Newark. And I plan to do all of that, to share all that. I think it's important. That's why I think your book has gotten so much love, because through telling the story of your father in particular, what an extraordinary story that is. This man who has some things to deal with, but despite them, he just, I mean, he was what we call an organic intellectual, and he lit the fire under daughter who became a world-class scholar. And you know, we need to do this more. We need to lift up the magnificence of our culture more, because the mainstream culture is still trying to act like we're, you know, we're thieves, or we're lazy, or we're victims, and all that kind of stuff. You know, when Black culture is the most humane culture in this country, and we don't get enough credit for that. We don't. I don't need any credit. I just wish they'd leave us the hell alone. You know, so we can live decent lives without them messing with us. Baraka wrote a poem, and I got in trouble for quoting in class. He said, and this is very profound. He said, "We do not need to be effed with." He didn't say effed,
Yeah.
but that's true. We don't need that. Yeah, and that was just one of the reasons I got put out of school in high school.
Well, you know, I think it's funny. I was thinking we were talking about our early influences, and I think that there's, on the one hand, there's the observation of the people in the community that raised me, and the family, and the struggles we had, but also the ethics, sort of
Yes,
deep ethics, and the deep love, you know, and as you said, the humanity, you know.
yeah, humanity.
And those were things that I observed, but I think what reading Tony early on did for me was it placed those kind of personal experiences in a broader context, you know, that it wasn't just me, it wasn't just my family, it wasn't just, and then, you know, as I went on to study, and I studied with people like Nathan Huggins as a historian, and then later on Cornel West, who was really profoundly, deeply influential, to lend a kind of historical depth and sort of philosophical depth to that experience of personal observation. So that it's, you know, I think that, as is the case often in the tradition of Black writing, the autobiographical is never only about the me.
Yeah, right.
It's a way of entering into, you know, if someone said to me, like, you know, is the memoir part of your book about you? I'm like, actually, no. It's about that community. And I know how much that sense means to you. One of the big fights that you have in this book, you talk about the kind of libertarian nature of right-wing white supremacist Christianity versus the kind of collective and community vision as you understand the teachings of Jesus, and you describe that community that you open the book up with.
Yeah, and the libertarian, the individualistic distortion of the foundational biblical ethic is one of the worst things that's happened to this country, and it's the bane of Christianity. You know, we should be concerned about the common good. I mean, it just makes sense. And throughout history, you know, regardless of religions, folk were healthy and had healthy communities because they were concerned about the common good, right? And then the foundational biblical ethic is communitarianism. And you know, that's one of the aspects of Black culture. I mean, we're seeing it dissipate more and more every year, but still, particularly in the South, there's more sense of community in Black culture than there is in the larger culture. But you mentioned Cornell, studying with Cornell, and that, you know, so interesting that we both studied with Cornell. When I was at Princeton, I had 2 one-on-one seminars with him, and he was one of my greatest intellectual influences. One was his great intellectual curiosity, but intellectual integrity at the same time. He And so he tutored me in Marxist literary theory. He was the first person I was ever around who was, totally ensconced in the life of the mind. Mary Baraka was my first intellectual influence, but Cornell. And the other thing that Cornell modeled for me was a certain level. The humility that I had lost having worked on Wall Street. So I can say that Cornell is one of my greatest intellectual influences, right? What did you gain from Cornell in your study with him?
Yeah, I think, well, I remember the first time I walked up to, I was in New Haven, a graduate student, and it was my first semester, and I walked up that hill to the Divinity School, which you know now, because you're teaching there. Walked up that hill, and I heard him lecture, and I came away. It was one of the most devastating moments in my intellectual life, because I came away thinking, oh my goodness, like I could start reading right now and read every day for 10 years, and I won't know what this man knows. So the first thing was like, intimidation. But as you know, you don't stay intimidated with Cornell for long, because he won't allow that.
And also you grow.
Yeah, you grow. Yeah. And also I think, what I learned is it's not about knowing it all. It's about, if you think you know it all, then you really are a fool. It's about wanting to learn more, and knowing that you can always learn. And so I think that it was just one, being able to talk about, as you say, the magnificence of Black life, and Black people as a kind of world historic people. And knowing that wanting to do that did not make you provincial, that you were also intellectually cosmopolitan, because you wanted to learn about all kinds of people. And all kinds of things, and just to be sort of hungry, a kind of intellectual hunger that was so important, and yet still be grounded. Things that I learned, that one could still be deeply grounded in this culture that meant so much to me, and yet also be distant enough to be able to view it critically, be able to place it side by side with other great grand cultures. So that was it. Yeah. And then I think at that time, when I think about it, Cornell was at Yale. My classmates were extraordinary. I mean, you had extraordinary classmates too. So
Michael Dyson, Eddie Glaude, right? Bill Hart, A.G. Miller. My God.
I had Saidia and Errol Lewis, and I mean, just Tara Hunter. I mean, I always say to graduate students, your teachers are important, but really it's your peers.
Push each other.
Exactly.
Learn from each other.
That's what you do. You learn from each other. So are you, I know you never asked, both of us wrote these books during the pandemic, in the height. Well, we wrote before, we were writing before the pandemic, but when everything shut down, like we were shut up with our books. Do you think that this period, I know that the rise of the man whose name I don't mention, greatly influenced your
the piece of
yes,
trash with the bad hair.
Did the pandemic influence it?
Did the pandemic influence
the book, or the conditions under which you were writing? What is there an influence of that moment that we were living through?
Well, yes, there was an indirect and a direct influence, I guess. The direct influences that I actually write about the pandemic and in the book, and how Trump and the right-wing evangelicals, their dastardly response to it, their deadly response to it. Indirectly, it affected me, I think, because it affected my mood. As you might remember, I had those terrible sinus infections, and then I had to have that terrible sinus surgery in the midst of writing. And so I was, you know, I not only was I outraged with what I saw, but I was, you know, I saw in society, but I was discomforted in my, you know, in my personal, in my bodily space. And so I guess that affects the tone of the book, you know, somewhat. I don't know. What do you think? Is it, I mean, the book is, it's an outraged book, but is it somber? I mean, is it a, I mean, whenever you talk about those folks, it's a downer, but did I make it more of a downer?
No, no, I don't think you made it more of a downer. I think you made it more urgent.
Hmm.
So anything that becomes urgent that you want to attend to with a sense of urgency, you know, there's one thing to observe, to simply observe without being moved, I think is a downer.
Hmm.
To observe and have a sense of urgency or a kind of fire, I think in and of itself, you can't move if you're down, you know,
Yeah,
or fully. So yeah.
that's true. Well, you know, we you asked me earlier about writing process. I'm going to share, and then I want to hear the same from you. And you know, as I think back, well, as you know, when I'm writing, I write all the time, and I have, you know, I can't count the times I've been driving and pull over the side of the road and sit and, you know, get some thoughts, particularly writing fiction, and right there, you know, I mean, you think it's funny that you have pictures of me writing in cafes all around the world. You know, I don't know. That makes me look like a real nerd, I think. But you know, but it is nice to be able to say, "Why he's writing this cafe in India. He's, you know, in Paris." You know, that'll sound good to the grandchildren. Um, but I when I'm writing, I do everything intensely. When I decide to do it, so when I write all the time. I write on the toilet. I write at dinner, right? I've written all the way through vacations. You know, that's just how I get it done. But I notice that you get it done differently. Tell us about it.
Well, you say wrongly that I write while watching bridal shows on television.
You do,
No,
Bridezilla.
I'm not writing.
You're right. And those house rehab shows, man. I see so many bride shows, man.
But I'm not writing like I'm taking notes. I'm writing a memo. I'm reading something that I just have to get done. It's not like I'm writing my book when I'm doing those things. But I think that I'm when I'm in a book, like I long to get back in that space of being in a book. I love that space. And it's hard getting there. It's so hard to get there. Once I'm there, it's like zoom, you know, you're in. And in that moment, those moments or that period, everything is writing. Like, and so going for a walk is writing. I mean, I wrote the last pages of this book. They came to me. I was on a walk in the park and sat down with my phone on a park bench and wrote like the last 2 paragraphs because I'm so in it. It's coming to me that way. But trying to get to that space, you know, I need the quiet time to hear myself think. I think the pandemic, writing this during the pandemic, I mean, I think we were both really aware that we were writing in a very historic moment, right? A kind of that there's been nothing like this, right? And so, like you, it certainly ends up in the book. It's in the book because it hit me once. I was like, wow, you know, there's a phrase that I use in the book, plague and slaughter. And those are words, those are biblical words, you know? I was like, wait a minute, we're living in a moment of plague and slaughter. after the killing of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd and too many to name. And so it entered into the book in terms of the content of the book. It's in there. That certainly would not have been the case had we not been living through that. But at the same time, I think had I not been forced to just stop, you know, all that traveling we used to do just stopped,
Yeah.
you know? And so all that time on planes, heading to airports, we just couldn't do it. I mean,
Yeah.
we weren't doing it anymore. And
Yeah.
the only traveling I was doing was going to Philadelphia every 2 weeks on the train. So it influenced the pandemic, both as in the book as content, but it influenced my writing because suddenly there was time to write. I was not going, I had already decided for my editor, I wasn't going to have time to write. And then I had time to write for very horrible reasons.
Yeah.
Not usually reasons, but horrible reasons. It certainly impacted and influenced all of that.
Yeah. That was a very difficult time, and we got through those books. So, what are you working on now? What projects do you have in your head?
Ooh. So I have a lot of projects in my head. I have a project, I'm not going to say too much about it because I don't want to jinx it yet, but I have a project where ruins will figure.
Say it again.
Ruins like dilapidated structure will figure. And this is just something I have been thinking about in terms of my reading. And then I also, when we went on that trip, we went to the Mediterranean, remember? And you were speaking, and we went to all those places, you know, Corinth and Rome and so being in those ruins, I started thinking about it then. That was like 3 years ago. I'm returning to that, wanting to write something about that. And then I have some other ideas that just aren't spoken yet. So, you know, I'm so superstitious, like, I don't want to name it. So what are you working on? What are you thinking about?
Well, you know, our dear brother, Michael Samanga, out in Atlanta, he's taken over the press from Haki Mahbudi, Third World Press, right? And he's asked me to suggest I put together a book of essays, and I'm working on the, you know, a lot of my so-called public intellectual stuff, but also some unpublished things that I think are significant. And as you know, I've written about a third of a book on the radicality of Martin Luther King. I hope to get back to that. But what I really want to do is I have in mind writing about, well, you know, now one of my major interests now is political economy. And so I want to write I'm trying to envision and to write what the beloved community that Martin Luther King talked about, what that would look like in terms of political economy, economic, social relationships, you know, legislation, all that. It's sort of like the kingdom of God and political economy, something like that, you know. And I want to do a lot more critique of capitalism. And I just happen to have right here a book that has given me some real affirmation, and book Religious Socialism, that has a treatment in there of my work. And that makes me really want to do a lot more work with democratic socialism religion, and critical thinking. So that's where I am now. But also, I can't leave out, I've written half of a novel.
Yes.
I wrote it years ago, maybe 10 years ago, based on the story of the demon-filled young man in Mark 5, who's has a demon and he's self-destructive. And Jesus asked him, asked the demon, give his name. The demon said, we're legion, for we are many, that right? And the book's gonna ask the question, what is it that drove the brother crazy? And so the main character is a Coltrane-like character, who's a son of a priest, and but he's a black sheep because he plays liturgical instruments. Well, not jazz, of course, but he doesn't play traditional music. Anyway, I want to use that as a way to look at all kinds of social and relational issues between Black men and Black women, and what Baraka called out culture and mainstream culture.
Wow.
Yeah.
Looking forward to that. Looking forward to that. I think it's time for us to look into questions, maybe.
I don't know. Is it? I think we have a few more minutes.
Ken is here.
I could do that. We could start. We don't have that many questions yet, but we could encourage people to bring some more in. I've just loved hearing about this writing process and that quote, Farah, like, in my head, I'm writing all the time. But then the process of like writing in your head, and then what's the difference between that and actually having a manuscript or something that like you feel like, oh, I see where this is going. Really.
But Ken, what I like to say, you look at where Farah and I came from. She was born in Philly, and the folk weren't folks of means. I was born in Farmville, Virginia, the same way. My father never finished high school. He finished high school when I was in high school. My past is a lot more checkered than hers. But still, we came from very modest backgrounds, and we look at where we are now. Like Farah mentioned, when she came to study with Cornell, here and lecture at Yale Divinity School, he was my professor. But I'm saying, like, damn, I'm teaching at Yale Divinity School now, man. I mean, the kinds of things we've been able to do and to publish, it's just extraordinary, extraordinary blessing. But what it also says is that, we don't see ourselves as particularly special. We're not. But there is a conclusion to be drawn, Farah, from the blessing of our careers. Would you?
Yeah, I think,
because you're more articulate than I am. So
I think without question, it's been a blessing. It's also been a series of opportunities that were made available to us. Like,
yes.
we all knew, you and I both knew people who were more talented, more, than we, and that because gifts and, intelligence, and that's pretty democratic the way that's given, however it's given. Opportunity is not. I think that we both were blessed, fortunate to be able to have access to opportunity and jump on it.
Yeah.
But it's one of the things that makes me, because I know how much talent there is, really want to fight for a more equitable world, more just world.
I think the rest of us are really blessed by the worlds you've made. No, seriously, the building and the production and the example and all the ways that you've made other things possible for people coming after, it's a huge gift to everyone else. So.
But it also has, I think about it, Farah talked about opportunity and doors being open. I know in my case, it's just very unlikely. I mean, just all kinds of unlikely things happened that offered me opportunities. Because I I had flunked out of college initially. I graduated in the bottom half of my class. You know, there are some things that are just supposed to be if we are trying to be faithful to ourselves, and continue to embrace a desire to make a difference in the world. Sometimes that just makes things come together that will open doors, no matter how much you might have messed up, as in my case. And so I always tell my students, embrace, try to figure out who you are and what you love early on. When I was 21, I asked myself, what would I want to do with my life? And I said, well, I'd like to be a teacher of philosophy and religion. And then I thought about it, wait a minute, you need at least a master's. And I didn't finish college. I can't do that. Well, my career started 20 years later when it could have started back then, because I talked myself out of it. My point is, if we ask ourselves questions, and this is to any young people who might be listening, students, get clear on who you are, what you want to do, and stick to it. And the way will be made if that's what you are supposed to do, and that's the way you make your contribution. Doors will be open to you. But it is about wanting to make a contribution and not just make a career.
Okay, I'm going to read some questions.
Okay.
Walter Booker asks you, Farah, in Read Until You Understand, Professor Griffin, you write powerfully of your unique spiritual path. And now you are married to one of the most incisive modern theological thinkers whose life has been deeply embedded in the church. How have your contrasting spiritual experiences informed your relationship and scholarship?
Oh, that's great. That's a wonderful question. I think that in many ways, one, that Obery, his deep knowledge has been a resource to me, a way of asking thorny religious questions, and his willingness to admit doubt, right? And his ways that he is, open. He's so open to someone who says, I don't believe that. I don't see that. I don't understand that. And he'll say, well, I don't either, right? His openness to a broad range of spiritual traditions, I think is something that we share, but he's more knowledgeable about those, like really having studied them, that it has been very, very influential. And then, just my being able to say, where can I find this? Who talks about this? What, reading his own work and seeing what he does with the Lord's Prayer, or what he does with how we are to be judged based on how we treat the least of these, which became a central theme in my book. So it's an ongoing, evolving series of conversations that we have. And I think that many people would be surprised by the stances that we each take. That, mine might look more like the conventional Christian, even though I don't claim to be one. And his would be the person who's questioning, doubting on all of that too.
So here's a question from Dr. Bernita Mitchell. Such rich and powerful discussion. What do you both do for downtime? Are novels a way to escape the seriousness of our time as a people and society?
But I'd say novels for me are not an escape. They just aren't. Like bride shows, shows about fixing houses. Those are my escape. But novels are work. Novels are study. Novels are honing my imagination and my skills and making me think and daring me to dream. So novels are not escape. And I actually think that they engage. They don't escape the seriousness of our time as a people and a society. They engage those things. I just finished reading Wally Soyinka's Chronicles of the Happiest People on Earth. That's not an escape.
Mm,
Engagement.
mm,
Contemporary Nigeria and the world.
mm, mm. Well, oddly enough, in the last year, one of my ways of relaxing is watching Westerns, old Westerns, black and white Westerns. Unfortunately, I've gotten hooked and I have to really stop because I watch them too much. But also, I unwind by reading, reading political economy, to be honest with you. I mean, it would sound like that's work, but that's just part of my interest. So on one hand, I'll watch Westerns, or I'll read a book about, Friedman and Samuelson, I know it sounds odd, but it's true. And it's eccentric, but it's true.
I think long drives are a downtime for both of us. Well,
Yeah.
I'm riding.
Yeah, we like to take long drives upstate and just into the country and see pretty stuff. And sometimes we'll, stay for the night. But mostly it's, bride shows and Westerns.
So just while you're with the Westerns, I'm going to give Walter Booker a second question because he has one for you, Obery. In Christians Against Christianity, Professor Hendricks, in the chapter exploring the theme of Christ's charge that we love one another as he loved us, you note how there was a contrast between Native Americans, see what I did there, and Euro-Americans' approach to homosexuality, the former being characterized by a humane acceptance of difference that was not the case among the latter. Can this contrast be ameliorated eventually? And if so, how? No easy questions to me.
Yeah, contrast between the humane acceptance of the humanity of folk who are slightly different, and those who are totally intolerant. There are aspects of Native American cultures that are just that are so basically humane and communitarian that American society will never be able to assimilate them. Capitalist society, individualistic, capitalistic, libertarian society will not be able to assimilate them. So no, I don't see it being bridged. There's not much that's humane about American culture. I mean, when you really think about it. And not only that, there is, I won't call them a hateful element, but there is an element of Christianity in America that is just intolerant and will always be intolerant, and it will always be self-righteous, and for that reason they will never fully accept gay people as equals or as beloved by God. I mean, that's the way I see it. I'm going to continue fighting like we all are, but those folks, many of them, they define themselves by who they are against, and that's not going to change.
So Charlotte Mallory has a question that might follow up on that. My dear friend, buddy, Dr. Hendricks. This is indeed a rich and powerful discussion that I've truly enjoyed. My question is to you. You mentioned writing your 2 nonfiction books from anger at what is happening in the church and the way in which Jesus has been portrayed. You made a statement that you feel anger about folks being abandoned to the church. Can you speak more on what you meant by that?
Thank you. That's a good point. And thank you, Charlotte. I must say, Charlotte's an old-time friend, and her her sister was my first love in high school, junior high school. So what I mean by being abandoned to the church, Stokely Carmichael was very smart. He wasn't. He realized the power of folk in the church. He also realized the need for their consciousness to be raised so they could embrace their full power, their full liberating power. And so when I say just leaving people, abandoning people to the church, I mean not trying to raise their political consciousness, not trying to show them the error of some of the ways of the church. That's what I mean by that. The church is my site of struggle and service. This is where, and I'm here. I've chosen to struggle against certain elements of backwardness and ignorance. I'm speaking in general terms, and no one should take offense unless they think it applies to them. And against entertainment orientation that's passing as some kind of spirituality or something. So abandoning folk to the church is just leaving them alone and not ever trying to change their circumstance or raise their political consciousness, or help them have a more healthy understanding of the Bible and its implications for the faith. I hope that answers it to your satisfaction, dear Charlotte.
Thank you. Ashley Clemens has a question I know you both have answered many times, especially Farah, but is very appropriate for intellectual publics. Thank you for such a powerful conversation. Are there any pieces of advice panelists may have for new PhDs, particularly who are approaching their first book projects?
Farah?
Yeah, so I would say Ken can answer that question. Ken produces some of the most brilliant first books, second books, third books. So, and actually, Ken, do you still give those workshops on the dissertation to the book and getting the first book out? Do you still do those?
I still do. I'll probably do one for intellectual publics in the spring, but I'm doing one for through the Futures Initiative and Haystack next week, I believe on the 27th. So that should be pretty easy to find through CUNY, through the
That's
Futures
the first
Initiative.
thing I would say. My first word of advice is get thee quickly to one of those kinds of seminars, workshops that Ken gives. You won't be sorry for it. And I think that, I do know many people who completely abandon the dissertation and go on and start all over, but I always encourage my students to, you've done all that work, it's your first contribution to scholarship, to work with it, and there's something there that you can do. And your first book is, there's a lot of stress around that, but you have produced a body of work. You've produced something, produced that dissertation, which means that you can. I would say also, I found that the manuscript workshops are very good. Some departments actually sponsor them. If you aren't in a department that will sponsor a manuscript workshop where some senior scholars or scholars come in and read your work seriously and offer you advice, that you can do it yourself. You can reach out to 2 or 3 people with whom you've developed relationships and ask them for that kind of close critical reading. And I think that those are 3 really valuable ways of getting that first book done and getting it out there. But get to one of Ken's workshops, definitely.
I would just say, make sure you write to be understood and not to impress, because it's a different orientation. In graduate school, we're writing to show our professors, what we know, and that we can use all the theory and jargon and lingo. But your book, you want to write to be understood, and it doesn't have to be dense. It doesn't have to be opaque, and it's better that it's not. And also write, keep in mind that you can sell some books if you write in a way that people understand and not just write for the handful of scholars in your field.
And then we have a question from a more experienced writer. Dr. Kathy Davidson asks, how wonderful to hear two intellectual giants in such a human, relatable, and ever-inspiring conversation. Thank you both. My question has to do with choosing topics. You've said anger is part of the motivation, but there's far more to be angry about than there is time to write books. What's the spark? What triggers the next book? And again, thank you for such a fascinating conversation, a rare glimpse into creative process.
I would say I want to hear Ken and Kathy do an intellectual publics conversation next in this, series. So I guess Obery and I probably have different answers to that question. I think that for me, usually I'm writing because I want to know something, like I'm trying to figure something out, and writing and putting it on the page helps me. It's something that I have some sense of and that I've read about, but I'm trying to make it make sense to myself and hoping that readers will come along with me. And so that first draft, I'm really trying to figure it out, answer that question. And then by the end of it, I have a sense of what it is I'm saying, which means I have to then go back in and actually write the thing that I found out. But I write to know, I read until you understand. I also write until I understand. I write to know. And oftentimes I don't know what I need to know until I start writing. I'll start writing and then I'll be like, wait, I can't make this transition. I can't make this logical leap. I can't do this because I don't know enough to do it. But now at least I know where to look. I know what I have to read. I know who I have to talk to get to it.
Yeah, I write to, I think, to try to empower, hopefully to inspire, but also to lay bare and to expose. In a certain sense, all my books have been sort of counter hegemonic in that I'm writing to oppose and to deconstruct prevailing attitudes and prevailing understandings, particularly about religion, because religion is such a field of contestation, but increasingly more having to do with political economy, capitalism, but it's always, I always keep in mind that Black people in particular so much has been kept from us, that those of us who've been blessed to get some training, I feel we have a responsibility to try to bring into the public understanding into a more critical public understanding, things that have been presented in a way that is oppressive and hateful, and often has people work against their own interests, if that makes sense.
So Farah, are you answering DeForest Raphael? Because I thought
I
that
was
might.
going to, but why don't you go ahead and say it if we have time?
Yeah, this will probably be the last question. There are a lot of other good ones around, but we're about at the end. But this is a good summing up and especially picks up on the points you were just making, Obery. At what point do we stop chasing after the lies of our enemies and begin pursuing our own truth?
Well, let me speak to that. Forrest Raphael is a brilliant pastor in Harlem, and as you can tell from his question, he's quite passionate. You know, I think that we have to do. I think I'm trying to do both things with Christians against Christianity. It is about exposing their lies, lies that millions of people have bought into and have distorted many lives. But you know, the work I'm embarking on in political economy is to try to explore a vision, a constructive vision for a more just and healthy way of living in society, a more just, non-oppressive way. But I think we have to do both. We have to do both things because we have to raise consciousness. We have to oppose their lies. We have to expose those lies because they have such purchase among the people. And so, yeah, we have to do both things. Now, but not everybody is going to do both things, and we shouldn't penalize them if they're only, if they're only doing one and not the other. In my case, I'm trying to do both. I'm not trying to be a jack of all trades, but I'm with you, brother. At some point, we do have to offer a constructive vision of the way the world wants to be, which is one of the biggest problems in the church because they don't have a constructive vision of the kind of world they want. You know, they talk about heaven, but they don't know what kind of economy they want. They don't know what kind of social relations they might know that more, but what kind of body politic they don't have. So anyway, those are my thoughts on it.
I would say that my answer is I think that my most recent book, Read Until You Understand, is all about pursuing our own truth. That's what the book is about. It's about our truth. So I'll stop there.
I want to thank you both so much. You've been so generous and really helpful. I know I'll be thinking about little lines that you each said like all the rest of the week. And I really appreciate you taking the time and coming over. I know everybody got a lot out of it, and we'll be posting it up on YouTube in about a week so people can tell their friends. But thanks everybody for coming, and thank you for doing this, and really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoyed it very much. Farah, I guess I'll see you soon.
See you soon.
Everybody have a good night, and thank you.
Good night.